Hamaguchi-san, Christos, congratulations. We will get started with the program of our Global Innovation Summit, and we'll have a very special session today, a global spotlight on bridging the planet and future growth. It is a distinguished pleasure to call our GFCC Distinguished Fellow, a member of the Parliament in Sierra Leone, a global leader for energy transition and fairness in the world, to lead that session, Dr. Kande Yunkela. Kande, thank you so much. The floor is yours, and please, you can call your fellow panelists.
Thank you very much. I wish to invite our colleagues on stage. Isabel Gil, President, Catholic University of Portugal. Please come forward to be part of the panel. Christopher Geiger, Vice President, Internal Audit and Enterprise Risk, Lockheed Martin Corporation. Thank you, sir. Paul Skoutelas, President and CEO, American Public Transportation Association. Good morning, colleagues. Thank you very much for a wonderful session all day yesterday. We want to thank the GFC and our wonderful hosts in Greece for their kind hospitality and very enlightening discussions. We have a wonderful panel, academia, private sector, and also public sector regulator and manager of the Transportation Association. We're looking at sustainability, climate change, and economic growth. And we have some set of issues we want to address. We are curious about what frameworks can facilitate sustainable economic growth while at the same time ensuring environmental safety and protection. What are the best examples of sustainable development across the globe? What breakthroughs do societies need to couple future growth with preservation of the planet? I'll go beyond these. Since I have a wonderful panel, I know there are a lot of curious questions. I'll try to see if I can make some linkages to the discussions we had yesterday. I'll start with Isabel Gale. Isabel, yesterday we discussed a lot about the academies and this link between science and public policy. From your standpoint, as you look at Portugal, but also the EU, do you see universities influencing, for example, climate policy, the targets that the Commission sets, the new Green Deal, for example, of Europe, which I know now Europe is promoting all over the world? How has your university or the universities in Europe influence climate policy, but also generally sustainable growth and green transition?
So good morning, everyone. Thank you, Kande, for the question. And before I start, I just want to say that as an academic, I'm in absolute awe of being in this room. And looking at these incredible frescoes, especially the myth of Prometheus, which represents everything we are talking about here today. Freedom, the one who gave, the hero who gave fire to humans, condemnation and then liberation by Heracles. He represents disruptive innovation, autonomy, freedom, everything we are fighting for here and that we aim to achieve with science and also in order to leverage economic growth. So I'm truly in awe, and I want to say how important it is for me personally, as it is certainly for all of us to be in this room today. Climate change, and first of all, I think we cannot separate the climate emergency from the other crises that we are facing at the moment. And you made that point yesterday as well. We don't have a climate crisis, a social crisis, and an economic crisis. They are all tied together. So the solutions that we find need to be organic and holistic. and there universities have a strong role to play. In Europe, I think that it is very important for universities to be aware of the power that they have, not only to lobby governments, but to provide evidence-based science that will allow for sound policy to be developed in order to tackle the great problems that we face today. Academics tend to be very critical. It's part of our activity, tend to be very critical also of the way in which we produce knowledge. So self-critique is very much at the heart of our endeavors. But when it comes to facing the complex problems, the complex global problems that we face, I think we need to do away with that self-critique, which is more often than not related to a certain navel-gazing that universities are prone to do, but really look forward to provide strong solutions. And in that, they certainly, they are experts, we are experts, and governments do need to pay attention not only to the science that we produce, but it is also on us to be able to communicate that well. So to be close, to foster ties to governments and to the industrial sector and the economic sector, to be aware of their needs, and in the specific situation of the climate emergency that we are living, to provide the best knowledge yet about the issues at hand. And I'm saying the best knowledge yet because in science, nothing is absolute. So we can only provide the best evidence at a certain moment that can be changed, adapted. This is the way science evolves. But to be able to communicate that to governments and also to the public at large, to the wider public at large. Because climate change and the emergence we're facing now will first necessarily need to start with strong policy. And it is not easy to communicate to voters that there are, that of course, the climate measures to tackle the climate change and the climate emergency will have an economic impact, and that this economic impact in certain areas of the globe will not be immediately, it will not be correlated with immediate evidence that that is something for their own egotistical well-being. Jean Tirole has has drawn our attention to the fact that it is difficult for many governments to implement policies for carbon neutrality and to tackle the climate emergence we are living, if not within a wider framework of a cultural change, because voters, for instance, in the global north, will not see immediately the benefits of those measures. They will be affected economically, they will pay more tax, but they will not see immediately those benefits. So it takes a lot of communication, and it's not simply policy. You need to align science with policy and with a sound communication to the communities. And universities are key players. They're not simply relevant, they're key players.
Yes. So if I hear you clearly, the analysis is good, but the narrative matters.
Of course. Yes.
And in Europe, I can give you an example. When we are discussing with Europe, we Africans, Europe stresses decarbonization a lot. Mm-hmm. And we argue it is not just decarbonization, it is jobs, it is growth, it is well-being. Is that the same sense you have, that even for European communities or other global communities, you have to make that link?
Absolutely, absolutely. It cannot be simply uncoupled. And that's why I was making also the question about the issue of migration. I mean, there's not, the crisis is connected. Pope Francis has made this point when he speaks about this and says this is a global crisis. It starts with education. We were talking about this yesterday. We need to educate the younger generations for not only to be more savvy in environmental terms, but to educate them to have the possibility to aspire. This is what Prometheus taught us, the ability to aspire, which is absolutely critical if we are to have a future of growth and a future of sustainability.
So let's have a little Socratic dialogue here. Yeah. So do you see in your students the desire, the ambition to tackle these problems? Do you see that in the young generation?
I see that. I see that they're not only aware, they demand that we take action. So it's a demand. But they have to, our role here is not only to provide the science, but also to make them aware of the fact that it is not only their issue, it is that they're globally connected, and that this is a matter that requires global collaboration.
I like that dimension, that our youth have to understand they have to talk to others across countries, across borders, across regions, because we're all in this together. I turn to the private sector. Christopher, you have an interesting job, Vice President, Internal Audit and Enterprise Risk. So you have an overview of the whole company and some of the systems and so on. As you look at your company, how does your company consider sustainability in its business models, in its general operations?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a framework I've borrowed actually from Europe is around double materiality. And in the US, it's not used very often. But it's the idea that there are some things that could be material issues that aren't yet financially material. And a lot of companies, just look at the next 1-2 quarters, or maybe 3 to 5 years. And issues around sustainability, around social and environmental action really take decades. And a corporation has to know where it's going, has to have a history. So we're a 100-year-old company, and we expect to be here another 100 years. And so when I led sustainability for the company, we actually did analysis out to 2080 for our facilities to know where we want to put things in one place or another. So, with that double materiality concept, we look at sustainability and understand that it's unique company to company, just like it is for country to country. An example with products, and this is where sustainability isn't just about risk, it's also about opportunity, because it's the solution to the risks that others have. We looked at the products that we have, which are primarily in the security and defense world, and said, how do we put these together to help with climate security and issues that relate to climate, but that are something that we do. It's not just reduce greenhouse gas emissions for every company, but it's how does that company, through its purpose, also affect these challenges? Don't just rest on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we actually look at firefighting as a service. We said we have firefighting helicopters. We have AI that can predict where there'll be firefighting. And it'll be a fire, a wildfire. This is a rising issue. This is something where we can actually connect that. And the average, U.S. county can't afford a fleet of firefighting helicopters. But if we call them and say, we can pre-position this and you can pay by the hour to use these helicopters, that actually is an opportunity, but it's solving a risk. It's mitigating a risk related to things. So when you look at your company, don't just look internally, but use that double materiality concept to find opportunity as well.
Since you mentioned products, one of the push in climate policy now is Scope 3 emissions.
Yes.
The impacts of your products. How are you dealing with that? Scope 3 emissions?
Yeah, certainly. So, Scope 1 and Scope 2 are your own emissions or emissions that you've purchased through utilities. Scope 3 is your supply chain, which we have tens of thousands of suppliers in the defense world and the aircraft, and then the use of your products. And I would actually flip it a little bit and say, in Scope 3, we design products that are used for decades. And in many ways, there's a throwaway society with our consumerism. So people they buy a phone that's, more than a supercomputer was 40 years ago, and they throw it away 2 or 3 years later. And we've never made products that way. Instead, we look at products to be upgradable and repairable, which in some ways should really be almost the right? People put a battery in a phone and say, oh, you can't do it. So, for instance, we're still flying the U-2 aircraft that we built in the 1950s. And you say, oh, well, you're still flying those rickety old planes, right? Well, we've been updating them and upgrading them. They're as advanced as any other plane that we have. New engines, new everything else. And in fact, the U-2 plane was the first aircraft that had AI on board that was changing its own flight software as it flew, that we trusted it so much. It was so understood the AI on it. So when we look at scope 3, we don't just look at what's in the near term, we look at very long term, and we recommend that people look to systems like in the defense world that are repairable and modular and can be upgraded, because we really, however smart we think we are now sitting here, those in the second and third generation after us are going to know so much more. We're not building systems that are permanent. The infrastructure that we're doing, we need to think of it in a temporary way, in a responsible way, as stewards. And so if you think about scope 3 in that way, I think it doesn't seem overwhelming anymore.
We also see something new, that for publicly traded companies, we see groups demanding what they call environmental, social, and governance assessments, ERSG. Are you responding to that? Do you see that as a threat or as another opportunity?
I definitely don't see it as a threat. Certainly our investors, we're a Fortune 100 company owned by the public essentially, and they definitely want to hear about that. They want more transparency. So as I led sustainability, we continue to respond to that. And so in the US, there's the Task Force Financial the TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and that really gets to that double materiality issue of, how is this going to affect you in the very long term? Another one was SASB, right, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and that's interesting. So as an accountant, I'm an accountant and an engineer. Accounting for GAAP rules, every company really does the same accounting essentially, or they ought to. But for sustainability accounting, it's really unique. And for SASB, it's industry to industry, because you don't always want the same ESG metrics from a cement company, as a defense company, as an advertising company. Because one may look very good. It may have very little emissions because it's all, software outsources it or something. But another company, but they may have a social issue. So I think it's important to tailor the ESG metrics, and we talk to sophisticated investors, but as also other people, the community, other stakeholders, our users. They understand that if you're in defense, maybe we don't want to push you in some areas, but we do want you in other areas, and I think that should be true across the board in companies.
Is your work made easier because, I'm assuming here, so if I'm assuming wrong, correct me. Is your work on sustainability made easier because your company deals mainly with big government defense contracts?
I wouldn't say it's easier, no.
In other words, you have to comply with public policy.
Well, we certainly do, but so does everyone else, right? We follow the rules and regulations like any other company. We primarily work with, as you say, with the US government. But with that customer, there's actually a lot of continuity. But at the same time, we have the same, customers are only one stakeholder. And if you just focus on that, I think you're blinded by, for instance, your employees. And we all have to share the same employees. And really, sustainability can be a major driver of who wants to come work for you. The greatest consumer of Lockheed Martin's sustainability documentation, our reports, is actually our prospective employees. It's recruiters on campus. So it's a 22-year-old who decides, am I going to come work for this company or that company? That's actually the biggest consumer of our sustainability data.
You opened another channel that I wanted to pursue a little bit. Yesterday we were talking about talent. The academics were talking about talent. How do we, there are a lot of leaders of universities in this group. Our colleague Isabel is one of them. what would you say to them about the talent you need for the future?
Well,
how do they prepare those young
Yes.
minds for you?
Well, you hear about how much of the currently known knowledge has been developed in the last year, right? So you're not teaching people to know everything anymore, if you ever were. So it's about learning to learn, and actually, in some ways, being very, very flexible. So the jobs that exist now didn't exist 20 or 30 years ago, and the same thing for the future. And we all know that, but to train for it is different. To know it is one thing, but to prepare people for it. And so for my own children, and you know, I explain, you may not know what it's going to be, and that's okay. It isn't, you're going to have to be this profession that exists now. I think because we all acknowledge change is accelerating, you're going to have to work with machines in a different way. We all learned how to work with computers. What about intelligent computers? Truly intelligent machines, and co-working with them. So when we do design now, it isn't we design an aircraft and then it flies. We do generative design, which means an engineer works with an AI, and we're not exactly sure what we're going to come up with. So we want to get the best wing, we're going to get the best engine performance. The engineer gives parameters and then works with an AI, actually jointly. That's the kind of mentality you have to be building into people.
Paul, I'll come to you in a minute, but I want a little conversation here between Isabel and industry. Isabel, you just heard the way Lockheed Martin, I'm sure representing some of the high-tech companies, are thinking of the next generation. How do you see your university and others responding to this desire now of these smarter, younger kids that are flexible?
Well, I must say I completely agree with what Christopher said about universities teaching their students, future graduates, to continue to learn. Yesterday, Venetia was talking about lifelong learning. This is the stuff, and this is the world we are in right now. So a degree is not the end of capacity building. It is the beginning. And in that sense, the initial degree needs to offer a broad vision of the problem. In medicine, for instance, we were talking about that yesterday with Dr. Hamaguchi. We have just set up a new medical school that is focused on tech-driven medical training, but it is a problem-based model of learning, which means that students, after their 6 years, we are providing them with the tools to continue to develop in medicine. Of course, it is impossible to train a doctor in every possible pathology, but you need to train a doctor to be a constant learner, a constant researcher, close, of course, to the needs of the patient, but needs to continue to learn throughout his life. And this is the model we are imparting in education. So broad training, teaching students to be able to discern, to make choices, and to continue to learn. Robert Maynard Hutchins, the American pedagogue who was president of the University of Chicago in the 30s, said something that may be a bit controversial in this environment, but it's quite true. In one of his speeches, he said that a university is not meant to train arms for industry, but to educate citizens, because good citizens will be excellent professionals. So it's not simply to train to do one functional instrumental job, but to be professionals. And in this sense, a professional is someone who can evolve, who can be transformed. We all started somewhere. My background is German studies, and I'm very proud of my background in German. What I do today is mostly management, politics, and other things. So we all evolve, and it is important that universities adapt to this flexible model.
I spent many years in the American land-grant tradition, and I remember one of my bosses, I was assistant to the dean for minority affairs in University of Illinois College of Agriculture, and I had a dean for academic affairs who used to say, We don't train kids for our past. We should train them for their future. And I think that's what you're talking about. And yesterday in our discussion, we talked about that intergenerational transfer. Climate change is something our kids and grandkids will inherit, and they have to be ready. And I think, Doctor, you were saying also yesterday, there might be other epidemics. Our kids have to be ready to learn from this recent epidemic to respond to the future one. We hope it doesn't come, but they have to be prepared. I think you've been talking about preparedness.
We will never be able to teach them everything they need to know.
Well, with that, I turn to Paul Skotelas, President and CEO, American Public Transportation Association. I used to head an agency in the UN in charge of industrial development. So I'm going to say something to you that they used to say to industrialists. Industry is the problem. And in some places here, it's the transport people that are the problems. But, of course, Lockheed Martin talked about opportunity. And we see now that, yes, we have to tackle emissions in energy. We're the culprits. But transport is the other big one. But that's linked to urbanization, mobility, and so on. What frameworks have you seen, and your association and others? How are you dealing with lowering your own emissions, but making mobility convenient for all of us?
Well, thank you for that, and great to be with you all. And last evening was fascinating to listen to some of the local initiatives here in Greece in terms of developing reforms in the government, making it more competitive, encouraging entrepreneurship and the like. Those are extremely important, as we know. My sector, as you have touched on, is really seen as the public basic infrastructure goods, the things that must be put in place to provide the foundation for business to thrive. And so my association is a public-private partnership. We have our public members, which are the transportation authorities that deliver services, that operate services, that build projects. And the private sector is the sector that provides the solutions, the technology, the know-how, the bandwidth, the capacity to deliver projects. It is that formula, I think, that provides a great platform for delivering what needs to be done to keep our urban centers and our cities thriving. As we look at the challenges that we face, we find that, and I'll say, public transport sits right in the sweet spot of many of these issues which have converged. Let me talk about what they are. Just 2 years ago, the new president, our new president, Joe Biden, entered the United States back into the climate accord, the Paris Climate Accord, a very major step back into the reality of what we're facing with climate. Secondly, it allows us as an industry, and I call it the transport industry, to be able to look at the initiatives that we make, understanding that this is a global challenge and one that we embrace as a country, as the U.S. Secondly, we have the issue of sustainability. Public transport, by definition, is sustainable. So for our cities to thrive and to continue to work towards attaining climate goals, we need more robust investment in public transport of all modes, of all rail and bus, to provide not only the climate goal attainments that we seek over the long term, and these are being done through things like electrification of our fleets, among other things, but also to do something else, which has really emerged in the U.S., in particular, I would say over the last 2 years with the incident occurring with George Floyd. And that is to bring a closer look at our society and to ask the question, what are we doing that really addresses these issues of equity? So when I talk now of public transport and transportation for our cities, we're talking not only sustainability goals, not only investment to improve people's mobility and access to jobs and to opportunity, but also where are we making these investments? Who's benefiting from the investments? Who's misrepresented or underrepresented in these investments? And we have a long history to look back on that you can begin to understand how we have perhaps missed the target on many occasions. You know, in the U.S., I, for one, and many others, look at our interstate system that we built through the 50s and 60s and 70s as a blessing in the sense that it tied our cities together. You could move from one city to another by automobile and do it relatively easy, although congestion has caught up with us. And what we have found is that that's wonderful, but it's one-dimensional. Our surface transportation network needs to provide mobility options for people to have choices. Not everyone can afford to own and to operate an automobile, and they shouldn't have to in order to be an active member of society that benefits from what we offer, what we provide. Holding a job, changing a job. Transportation should not be an impediment to do that. So these are the things that we're working on with our membership. A year ago, the President signed into law a new piece of legislation, the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, which is going to provide and is providing over $200 billion over 5 years for more investment in what I've just been describing to you, public transport initiatives, modernizing and expanding our transportation throughout our major urban centers, also some of the rural areas as well, because we can't neglect them, but major investments in our urban centers, which again speak directly to the issues of sustainability, mobility, and equity. And those are the things that we keep in focus as we go about our decision making.
Let me take you on the equity side. Mobility in the suburban areas, main cities, mobility in the inner cities. I ask you this because in another career I had, I used to recruit students in the inner city of Chicago. So I'm asking there about equity and inclusiveness. To what extent are these new initiatives on e-mobility, efficient mobility, also reaching inner cities where you have the poor?
They are, and they need to a further extent. Again, as these bodies, these local boards of directors that direct the investment levels, because these decisions are made at the local level. At the federal level, we're looking to advocate for more investment, which we have done now successfully for this first phase that I described to you, the Investment Act. But the decisions of how to use those resources, where to apply those resources, what projects, what services, those are local decisions. And every board, you mentioned Chicago, the chair of our board right now is the president of the Chicago Transit Authority. And he is moving forward with great support from stakeholders, a project called the Red Line, which is to extend into South Chicago, an area that has not been served for 50 years in terms of a rail network. We can hypothesize as to all the reasons for that. But the reality is these boards are now looking at these issues of equity in terms of serving their population.
We're in Greece, and of course, going back to what Isabel said, we want partnerships, not only domestic, but we're looking at solidarity across the world. I wanted to ask you, to what extent does your association collaborate with European, Asian associations? There are some innovations taking place in mobility in Asian countries that are probably a little bit ahead of you. Yes. Is there some collaboration, knowledge sharing? Because remember, we all live in the same small carbon space.
That's a great question. We are believers that while we think we do some things very well, we're not necessarily ahead of the game in terms of investment in our public transport systems. And so we have existing memorandums of understanding with UITP, which is our international counterpart. We have a similar arrangement with what is called CUDA, the Canadian Urban Transit Association. And we are constantly doing exchanges with them, webinars on a frequent basis, study missions. We concluded a study mission to Canada just right before the pandemic to exchange ideas on project delivery and innovation and such. So we think that's an important piece. We don't profess to have all the answers and solutions in place from the vantage point of our membership in the U.S., but we do believe exchanging, understanding different points of view, different ways to think about issues is really important to our members.
I come back to you, Isabel. As you listen to industry, you listen to the associations, one of the roles of the universities is to really that dispassionate, strategic look at how systems perform. As you listen to them, part of the role of the academy as well is accountability. Looking at these systems, are they working well enough? Are they moving as fast as we should? So I take you back to the Green Deal. Are you satisfied that in Europe, the rollout of the Green Deal is moving fast enough, the way you academics would want it? Sometimes academics are more ambitious than we, the policymakers.
I think we're moving slow. I mean, that's true. It's not only what we feel as European citizens, as academics, but it's also what's being demanded by the students. As we speak, in Lisbon specifically, there is a climate strike going on. So there are a number of schools occupied by climate activists. And it's a symbolic action, of course, but it is a symptom. I mean, many of the climate activist exploits are shocking to us. For instance, the interventions at state museums damaging great art by, the great masters. It is shocking. And it is not, those actions should not be condoned, but I think we need to pay attention what they mean. The symptom is out there. It's a symptom of a generation that is not at ease with the way things are going, that it's concerned about their future, the future of their children and their grandchildren. And we need to pay attention. I think it is, no matter how insane those activities may seem to us, they're a symptom of something deeper. Universities are, I would say, labs of the world. The concept university means universal, so we basically test beds for new solutions to improve the way we live together and in our planet. And Chad Holliday was making that point yesterday. This is also what we're here to do, to discuss ways of improving life. And universities are excellent test beds for that, because we have the knowledge, the tools, and the talent to discuss the problems, actually apply the scientific method to real-life crises and real-life problems. The difficulty is the transition from the test and the experiment into reality, right? How do you, and in a wider form, we've been talking about patents and products and innovation going to market, but this is a wider thing because it is systemic. It's not simply a product, it's about a solution that cannot be simply developed by one country independently. It needs to be done collectively, and we have enormous difficulties across the globe to work together in that regard, and the COP is a good example of that. We had also an example with a certain vaccine nationalism at the beginning of the pandemic. One important way to go ahead is what some scientists have been calling for, which is data diplomacy. And data diplomacy is an initiative to allow universities, scientific centers, science-driven companies to share data, to work together, to share data. That requires, of course, something that Dr. Hamaguchi was talking about, trust. Trust, and you need to trust the players, right? I don't believe there is global trust to have a global data sharing at this moment, right? Because we know that we have actors that will get the data and will use it for purposes which are not the purposes that they were initially meant for. But we could start with the trust that exists amongst the partners that share that trust, and it would be a way to go ahead. As you know, in Europe, there's a big move towards open science, especially to share science and data sponsored by state funds. There's a big initiative, strong initiative in this regard, and I do believe it's the way to go ahead. Now, just to stop, if you think we're moving fast enough, we're not moving as fast as we could, but we are treading the way, which is already a good start.
Christopher, I give you the last word. Technology, we said yesterday, technology is part of the answer. As you look ahead, stargaze for us. I'm not going to do 5 years. It's too short for you. You're Lockheed Martin. 10 years from now. How do you see, what technologies do you see that could make a difference in how we tackle particularly climate change? Where do you see the hope? Or what business, maybe it's a business model, it's not a technology, that we should be looking at? Some game changers.
Well, and so you often don't predict the exact technology, but in general, I think it has to be in infrastructure. And that may sound boring, but that's where sometimes we have fallen short. And you mentioned transportation infrastructure, and I mentioned earlier, you can't build forever, or else you'll never build it. And it'll never work, unless you're building a temple on a hill, and then maybe you should. But otherwise, you need to look at things that can be kept and maintained and redone over and over again. So an example I'll give you is we're actually building lunar infrastructure, right? So we're being tasked with putting a GPS, GPS for the moon, doing an energy system on the moon, lunar mobility. And as we look at that, the resources there are even more precious than on Earth. So the amount of water that's at the poles, it's too expensive to bring more water, so you have to use that water perfectly. Or the International Space Station and how we've maintained that for over 20 years. Again, over $50,000 per pound to get anything up there. So we reuse all of the food, we reuse all of the liquid. Think about how we're able to do that. It's not permanent, but use technology as you have it to learn and to get to that next step. And so if it's your country or your region or your corporation, you don't have to plan forever, to plan for right now. Now, so think about what's going to happen with that space station. We spent billions of dollars, and what are we going to do? We're going to responsibly drop it back into the atmosphere, and it'll be destroyed. Now, that's responsible because it doesn't blow apart, right, and make a mess in low Earth orbit. But at the same time, we're learning from it so that then the moon will have better infrastructure. We never would have been able to go to the moon without the space station. And then that's the stepping stone to go to Mars. And the same thing with your country. You don't have to go to perfectly circularly sustainable right now. Think of what are the steps to learn and get there. And technology can really be that bridge.
Well, Paul, I was going to save you, but he said infrastructure. So I have to draw you in. What's your moonshot?
I'll tell you, the moonshot is pretty basic, hard to achieve, and that is continuity in policy. Energy policy, transport policy. If our biggest challenge is if it changes every 2, 3, or 4 years, it's very difficult to stay the course and get done what you need to have done. So I think continuity of policies, irrespective of the politics, is important in terms of attaining the goals that we seek.
I think Paul knows I'm a parliamentarian. Continuity irrespective of the politics. I like that ending. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we want to thank our panel. We've tried to connect the dots with them. Let's thank them for their wonderful presentation. Thank you.